What is sovereign capability and why is it important? We're going to explore answers to those two questions in today's episode of Climate Mundial's Energy and Climate Weekly. So let's get right into it. These two questions today are inspired by feedback received from viewers to a video that I posted last week, which was an interview that I had done with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation on the latest developments regarding the Whyalla Steelworks, which is a major steel producer in Australia, which has been experiencing some financial difficulties. The word sovereign capability is mentioned quite a lot by policymakers when discussing whether or not it's justified to provide some public funding to try and help this business and to try and find new owners for it. Now, in principle, sovereign capability is a term that I think the general public has a hard time understanding. So it's really important in this video to try and explain a few of the terms so that there's more clarity relating to that. Now, the first thing to say is the word sovereign itself usually refers to a nation state and its ability to self-determine. So that is to make rules for itself. So that's a really important thing to first understand is what sovereign means. And in terms of sovereign capability, it really refers to the ability of a country to continue to satisfy its critical needs, especially in the event of some type of external disruption. And in that regard, steel is being discussed in the context of this sovereign capability and this ability for Australia to carry on its business, even in the event of external disruptions. So that's what we're going to look at a little bit more closely in today's episode. So what exactly are the kinds of products, services, and resources that are going to be considered critical for the needs of countries? Well, in the first instance, products are very important. That could include anything from raw materials through to finished products. Finished products being things like steel, aluminium, cement, as well as manufactured products like computers or even microchips. The next area is food. It goes without saying that a country would need to be able to satisfy the nutrition needs of its country. And in some cases, countries are self-sufficient, but in other cases, they need to import a certain component of the nutritional needs and the food needs of the country. Another one is also capital, and that is the financial resources that flow into a country, whether that be through foreign direct investment or the income that's generated from exports. And those financial resources can also be critical for then being able to finance imports. That's a really important area to consider as well. Another is communication infrastructure and resources that allows people within a country to be able to communicate with one another. And finally, the other one, which is often discussed in this regard, is military equipment and equipment related to the security of a country, whether that be through vehicles such as ships, tanks, planes, etc., through to the actual equipment and technology that's needed for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. So all of those things together, and you could probably also put human resources and personnel into that category. And as we saw during the pandemic, there was a cutoff in the ability for people to move across borders, and in some cases that affected the vital interests of certain countries. But this package of goods, services, and also resources really represents the body of products and items that could be regarded as critical for certain countries. It's also very important to point out the role that energy plays in the overall sovereign capability of countries. Now, clearly, not every country has enough energy resources to satisfy its own needs and needs to engage in some degree of importing, and there are others that are in a position to export. Energy is critical for day-to-day activities, for transport, for moving things around economies, for keeping people warm during the winter, for keeping people cool during the summer, And so energy is really, really important. Specifically, if one looks at things like crude oil, it's not just the availability of crude oil itself, but also the capability to refine that product and to produce petrols and aviation gas and so forth for the aviation industry or the road transport industry. So, refining capability is very important. And it's also really important to recognize then that renewables are particularly important for some countries who may not have an abundance of fossil fuel reserves and energy supplies domestically, but renewables offer the opportunity to become self sufficient for certain countries, particularly when it relates to things like solar energy and wind energy, which are available on the sovereign territories of those countries. The next question to ask is, what are the kinds of external disruptions that could affect countries? Well, in the first instance, and as mentioned before, things like the pandemic restricted the ability of countries to move people from location to location. It also affected the ability to trade. There were often delays and things like that in supply chains, delays at ports, and different receiving points for international commerce. So, those are really important elements to recognize. Another type of external disruption could actually occur as a result of things like industrial action or natural disasters in other countries that are not necessarily inside the country that's affected, but they do influence the ability of imports and exports to occur into a certain country. And so, therefore, that becomes a major issue that requires management. The less savory types of external disruptions can also occur as a result of military action. For example, either a direct war or, in fact, an indirect war, that is, a war occurring between other countries, could actually interrupt or affect the supply, whether it be of goods, services, or resources to another country. And so that's a very important one to recognize, as indeed are things like trade blockades, which are often part of an overall military campaign, which can basically stifle the flow of goods and services into a country and are designed in some way to affect the country in that way as part of the overall military campaign. Finally, it's important to recognize that there are certain trade barriers themselves which could actually become a disruption at some point in time. Tariffs increase the price of goods and services, but in principle, it might be that the tariffs are so high that they become an effective embargo, which actually prevent the passage and the trade of certain products, services, and resources. So that those are the really important basket of events that may lead to a supply disruption or an external disruption, which could affect the needs of a country. So, given all the potential benefits that would come from self sufficiency and resilience, the relevant question here is, why aren't countries already doing a lot to be self sufficient? And I guess in principle here, we need to recognize a couple of things. The first is that resilience comes at a cost. If a country decides that it wants to be self sufficient, even though it doesn't have a comparative advantage at producing a certain product, service, or resource, then it needs to make a decision to incur greater costs and to have its consumers spend more to receive the same products and services. That's really, really important. And in the case of resources, it may actually be that certain countries do not have within their territories the certain resources that are needed to actually produce certain products. So it's a big decision for a country to make to want to be self sufficient. The other point is that the sorts of incidents that would lead to this type of external disruption, as mentioned before, could actually be quite rare. So one always has to balance the probability of these things occurring with the potential cost of actually becoming self sufficient or more resilient. The other important factor here is that most of this type of ongoing commerce is actually, or in most countries, is actually undertaken through decision making that is made by private sector players or private businesses. And therefore, the governments really only have limited influence over the decision making of those firms. Of course, they can introduce laws that prohibit or require that certain activities take place, or introduce taxes and tariffs and things like that, which would incentivize certain types of business. But at the end of the day, there are decisions that need to be taken by private sector actors, and therefore, for a government to come in over the top and say, this is the result that we're going to try and achieve, requires that there be some type of change to that. And that's really quite a difficult thing to implement for a lot of countries. So you can see very clearly why it is quite difficult for countries to actually execute this ambition, if you like, of being self-sufficient, or for that matter, resilient in certain product, services, and resource areas. So there it is. There's a brief summary of what could be regarded as sovereign capability, the types of products, services, and resources that might be regarded as being critical in the context of any given country, the sorts of events that might give rise to a supply disruption or some type of external shock that would affect a country, the likelihood that those sorts of events are going to occur, and also some of the complications that countries will have in trying to achieve self sufficiency or resilience objectives, especially where they're largely dealing with private actors operating in the general economy who make those decisions on a day to day basis and would therefore need to have some type of incentive or some type of regulation that would help them to then make decisions in accordance with the objectives of the country. Please let me know what you think about the topic of sovereign capability, whether it's in fact worthwhile, how you would go about dealing with this issue. If you like the video, please do press like, do subscribe if you haven't already done so, and be sure to share the video with your family, friends, and colleagues. That would be a really good way to assist the channel, and it will also help me to understand the kinds of topics that are of interest to you and then help with the production of further videos. So on that note, I'd like to say thank you very much for your attention today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon in the next episode of Climate Mundial's Energy and Climate Weekly. Bye for now.